A widow with nothing asked for shelter. He gave her his name instead. She knocked on the wrong door. That is what she told herself afterward, in the weeks when she was still trying to make sense of how her life had rearranged itself so completely in the space of a single winter. She had meant to knock on the door of the church. The minister lived 2 houses down from the ranch on the edge of Sawyer Creek, Colorado, and she had been walking in the dark and the cold, and the snow had been coming sideways, and she had counted the wrong number of fence posts and knocked on the wrong door. But the door opened, and the man standing in the light of it looked at her and at the small child pressed against her side, and at the bundle in her arms that was a second child, an infant barely 6 weeks old, and he did not say, "Who are you?" or "What do you want to come back in the morning?" He said, "Get inside, it's freezing." And that was how it started. If you have ever been so far down that you stopped asking for what you actually needed and started asking only for the smallest possible thing, just shelter, just one night, just enough to survive until morning, this story is for you. And if you love slow, tender, deeply emotional Western romance stories about women who had nothing left and the quiet men who gave more than was asked, you are in the right place. Leave a comment below right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from. And if you are new here, please subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now let me tell you about Vera. Vera Standish was 28 years old, and she had been a widow for 11 weeks when she knocked on that door. 11 weeks, which sounds like long enough to begin adjusting to a thing, but is in fact nowhere near long enough when the thing in question is that your husband is gone and you have a 3-year-old daughter and a newborn son and $40 to your name and a landlord in Denver who has already sent 2 letters about the rent. Her husband's name had been Martin Standish. He had been a decent man, not brilliant, not lucky, but decent and hard-working in hers, and she had loved him in a practical daily way that is perhaps less celebrated than the grand kind, but is in many ways more sustaining. He had been a carpenter's helper, and he had been building the frame of a new building on Larimer Street in Denver when the scaffolding gave way. And that was the whole of it. One morning, he left for work, and that afternoon 2 men she had never seen before came to the door with their hats in their hands. She had not fallen apart. She had wanted to. She had felt the falling apart pressing behind her eyes and in her chest like something waiting to happen. But Millie was 3, and the baby was coming, and falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. So she had managed. She had sold what could be sold. She had written to Martin's family in Missouri, who had written back with sympathy and nothing practical. She had written her own mother in Grand Junction, Colorado, who was herself living on the charity of Vera's older brother and his wife, and could not reasonably take in a daughter and 2 grandchildren. Her mother's letter had mentioned, almost as a postscript, that there was a town called Sawyer Creek, about 40 miles from Grand Junction, where the minister, a man named Aldrich, had been known to help people in difficult circumstances. The church had a small fund for widows. It was worth asking. Vera had spent 2 of her remaining dollars on a stage ticket to Grand Junction, where her mother had pressed another $12 into her hand, and wept and apologized, and Vera had held her and said it was all right, which was not true, but was what needed to be said. Then she had spent 3 more dollars on the stage to Sawyer Creek, and arrived in the dark and the snow and the cold with a 3-year-old and a 6-week-old and $37, and the address of a minister written in her mother's careful hand. And she had counted the fence posts wrong. The man in the doorway was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark blonde hair that had gone a little long, and the look of someone who had been indoors working and had not expected company. He was perhaps 35. He had blue eyes that registered the situation with a speed and completeness that told her he was the kind of man who assessed things accurately and quickly. He said, "Get inside, it's freezing." She got inside. The house was warm, which hit her like something physical after the cold outside. There was a fire going in the main room, a lantern on the table, the remains of a solitary supper. The room was plainly furnished and clean, in particular way of a man living alone who has not given up on order entirely. The little girl, Millie, pressed herself against Vera's leg and stared at the man with the wide, serious eyes of a child who has been in too many unfamiliar places recently and has learned to wait and see. The infant, 4-week-old Henry, was mercifully asleep in his wrappings. The man looked at them. Then he looked at Vera. "Sit down," he said. "You look like you're about to fall over." She sat down because she was, in fact, about to fall over. He put a kettle on without asking and found a blanket and held it out to her, without making a production of the gesture, and then crouched down to Millie's level, which Vera noticed immediately because most adults do not think to do that, and said, "Are you hungry?" Millie looked at him gravely. Then she nodded. He nodded back, equally gravely, and went to find food. His name was Colt Briggs. He told her this while she drank the tea he had made, and Millie worked her way through a bowl of leftover beans with the focused efficiency of a hungry child. He told her he had the ranch, 160 acres on Sawyer Creek. Cattle mostly, a few horses. He lived alone. The minister she was looking for lived 2 houses east. "I counted the fence posts wrong," she said. "The Aldrich fence is missing 2 posts on the south end," he said. "Easy to miscount in the dark." She looked at him over her teacup. He was sitting across the table from her with his hands around his own cup, not making her feel observed or assessed, simply present in the way of someone who is comfortable with quiet. "I'm not here to impose," she said. "You knocked on a door in a snowstorm with 2 children," he said. "That's not imposition. That's necessity." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I'll go to the minister in the morning." "Yes," he said. "Tonight you'll sleep here. There's a spare room." She opened her mouth. "Mrs." He paused. "Standish," she said. "Mrs. Standish. It's 11 degrees outside, and the snow is not stopping. Whatever you're going to say about imposing, I'd ask you to consider the children first and your pride second." She looked at him. It was not unkindly said. It was simply direct in the way of someone who did not have patience with the polite back and forth of refusal and insistence when the practical answer was obvious. She considered the children. "Thank you," she said. The spare room had a bed with a quilt and a window that rattled slightly in the wind but held. She put Millie in the bed and settled Henry beside her, and stood in the dark room for a moment, listening to the snow and the fire from the other room, and the breathing of her children. She thought about Martin. She thought about the scaffolding on Larimer Street. She thought about 11 weeks of managing alone. Then she thought about a man who had crouched to a child's level, without being told to, and found her beans without making a kindness that required payment. She slept for the first time in what felt like weeks. In the morning the snow had stopped and the world was white and clean, and the minister Aldrich, who was a small energetic man with kind eyes, received her in his parlor and told her about the widow's fund, and also about a woman in town named Gertrude Foss, who sometimes took in boarders. Vera thanked him and walked back past Colt Briggs's ranch in the clean, cold morning with Millie beside her and Henry in her arms. Colt was in the yard splitting wood when she passed. He stopped. She stopped. "How did it go?" he said. She told him about the fund, which was modest, and Mrs. Foss, whose room she had not yet seen. He nodded, split another piece of wood, then said, without looking at her directly, "Mrs. Foss's rooms are cold, and she does not allow children to run indoors," which with a 3-year-old is an interesting position to take. Vera looked at him. "You know her rooms?" "My foreman's wife stayed there one winter before they built their house," he said. She said it was like living inside a disapproving opinion. Despite everything, despite 11 weeks of grief and anxiety, and not enough sleep, something almost like a laugh moved through her. She pressed it down, but she suspected he saw it, because something shifted very slightly in his expression. "I have a spare room that no one uses," he said, still splitting wood, still not quite looking at her. "It is warm. Children are permitted to run indoors within reason. The widow's fund would cover a fair board, and I would have helped with the cooking in the house, which I am adequate at but not gifted." He set the axe down and looked at her then, directly and without pretense. "It is a practical arrangement. Nothing more than that. You would have your own space, and your children would be warm, and you would have time to find your footing without Mrs. Foss's opinions." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. He seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because you knocked on the wrong door and I opened it," he said. "And having opened it, I find I don't particularly want to close it again." She looked at the white, clean yard and the solid house and the window of the spare room, where her children had slept warm last night while the snow came down. "A practical arrangement," she said. "Nothing more," he said. She moved in that afternoon. The practical arrangement was not simple. It was not simple because Sawyer Creek was a small town, and small towns have strong opinions about widows who move into the homes of unmarried ranchers, regardless of the practical merits of the case. Within a week, Vera was aware that she was being discussed. She could feel it in the way women looked at her in the general store, in the particular quality of the silence that fell when she came into a room. She bore it the way she had learned to bear difficult things, quietly and without showing the cost. Colt bore it differently. He seemed largely unaware of it, or he was aware, genuinely unconcerned in a way that was not performance, but simply the disposition of a man who had always found the opinion of people who did not know him personally to be of limited interest. The thing about living alongside someone is that you learn them in the small ways first. The large ways come later. The small ways are more honest. She learned that he was up before dawn every day without exception, and that the first thing he did was start the fire and put the coffee on, and that by the time she came downstairs with Henry, the kitchen was already warm. She learned that he had a way with Millie that was patient and unforced, getting down to her level, speaking to her like a person, answering her relentless 3-year-old questions with seriousness that Millie clearly found deeply satisfying. She learned that he read in the evenings, history mostly, and that he did not feel the need to fill silence with noise, which she found more restful than she expected. He learned things about her, too. She could see him learning them. The way his attention gathered when she said something, the way he noted her habits with a quietness that was not intrusive but simply present. He learned that she was competent in the kitchen and knew it without arrogance. He learned that she cried sometimes at night, not loud, but the kind of quiet crying that a house hears anyway, and that she always had herself composed by morning. He learned that she talked to Henry while she fed him, long, soft conversations about whatever was on her mind, as if the baby were simply a very small confidant, and that watching her do this did something to his expression that he seemed unaware of. He learned that she was braver than she looked, which was already quite brave. The first hard thing between them happened 6 weeks after she arrived. She had been to town and had heard, more clearly than usual, more pointedly, the talk about her situation. A woman named Pauline Geary had said something to her face, wrapped in concerned way truly unkind things often are, about the appearance of the arrangement, and what it said about Vera's character, and did she not think of her children's reputation? Vera had come home and put the children down for their nap, and stood in the kitchen, and let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly 5 minutes. Then she started making supper. Colt came in from the barn and looked at her and said nothing, but she could feel him assessing. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "I know you are," he said. "What happened?" She told him, kept her voice even, reported it like weather, something impersonal, conditions to be noted and accounted for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's not your fault." "No," he said, "but it is my problem to solve." He paused, and she looked at him, and there was something in his face that was carefully arranged, as if he was managing the pace of something. "There is a solution that would end the talk," he said slowly. "I want to put to you plainly, and I want you to know there is no pressure attached to it in any direction." She waited. "Marry me," he said, "not for the reasons a man usually asks, for the practical ones. Your name becomes Briggs, and the children's names become Briggs, and Pauline Geary runs out of things to say, and you have a permanent roof and a real stake in this place." He looked at her steadily. "You have been nothing but an asset to this house since you came into it, and I am not a man who fails to recognize what something is worth." She stood very still. "That is not a usual proposal," she said. "I'm not a usual man," he said, "and I don't think you'd be well served by a usual proposal right now. I think you'd be better served by the truth, which is that this makes sense, and I mean every word of it, and I would never make you regret saying yes." She thought about Martin. She thought about love that was practical and daily and sustaining. She thought about what she actually needed, which was not romance right now. It was safety and steadiness, and someone who crouched to Millie's level. "And you," she said carefully, "what do you get from this?" Something moved in his face that he did not fully hide. "Someone worth coming home to," he said quietly, "which is more than I've had." She looked at him for a long time. "I need you to know something," she said. "I am still grieving Martin. I will be for some time. I cannot promise you feelings I don't have yet." "I know that," he said. "And I don't want you to feel that you've been cheated of something when it turns out this is harder and slower than a practical arrangement accounts for." "Vera," he said, and his voice was very gentle, "I am a man who has been patient about most of the important things in my life. I am not afraid of slow. She looked at the kitchen she had been cooking in for 6 weeks, warm and plain and honest. She looked at the door of the room where her children were sleeping. She looked at this man with his blue eyes and his crouching down to small people's level and his not being afraid of slow. All right, she said. Yes. They were married by Minister Aldrich on a Thursday morning in February. Just the four of them and Pete the foreman as witness. Millie standing very importantly at Vera's side in a dress Vera had pressed the night before. Henry, asleep in the cradle of that colt, had moved to the main room for the occasion. Aldrich said the words, and they said them back, and Colt put a ring on her finger that had been his mother's, plain gold, worn smooth with years, and she felt the weight of it with solemnity that surprised her. Walking back to the ranch in the cold, bright February air, Millie between them holding both their hands and swinging herself forward with the complete physical confidence of a child who has decided a place is safe, Vera felt something she had not expected to feel so soon. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. Something that felt like the first solid ground after a very long time of uncertain footing. Spring came slowly to Sawyer Creek that year, the cold holding on through March and into April, but it came. The garden along the south side of the house that had been dormant all winter began to show green. The creek ran high and cold with snowmelt. The cattle began to move differently in the pastures, with a loose, easy movement of animals that have stopped bracing against cold. The house changed, too, in the way that houses change when they are fully inhabited rather than just occupied. There were small drawings of Millie's on the windowsill. There was a particular chair in the main room that had become Vera's chair by a process of gradual mutual acknowledgement. There were sounds in the morning that had not been there before. Henry's early noises, Millie's running feet, the particular rhythm of two adults moving around a kitchen together, without colliding. Colt was good with the children in a way that was not performed. He was consistent, which was what children needed most, and what Vera had learned to look for above all other things. He did not promise Millie things he did not do. He did not lose patience with Henry's nighttime noise. He repaired Millie's broken toy horse with the same careful attention he gave to ranch equipment, because it mattered to her and therefore it mattered. Vera watched him with them and felt the slow movement of something she had told herself would take a long time. It was taking less time than she had said. That frightened her slightly, because she had loved Martin and Martin was gone and love was the thing that made loss catastrophic, and she was not sure she was ready to risk being catastrophic again. She told him this one evening in April. They were sitting on the porch in the first genuinely warm evening of the year, and the children were inside, and the ranch was settling into its spring night sounds, and she said it plainly the way she had learned he preferred things said. "I find myself feeling things I told you would take longer," she said, "and it frightens me." He looked at her for a moment. "Because of Martin?" he said. "Because of Martin," she agreed. "Loving someone means losing them is unbearable. And I know what unbearable feels like now, and I am not sure I want to risk it again." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the spring dark. "I can't promise you I'll always be here," he said slowly. "No one can promise that honestly. Scaffolding gives way. That's the truth of it." He paused. "What I can promise is that whatever time there is, I will not waste it, and I will not make you sorry you let me in." He turned and looked at her. "I think you already know that, Vera. I think that's what's frightening you." She looked at him. He was right. That was exactly what was frightening her. Not the risk of loss. The risk of already being sure. She reached across the small space between them on the porch and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The moment that made Sawyer Creek understand what the Briggs household was came in May. Millie had been playing near the creek bank, which she had been told twice not to do alone, and had slipped on the muddy edge and gone in. The creek was running fast still with snowmelt, not deep but fast, and Millie was 3 and frightened, and the current had her moving before she could get her feet under her. Colt had been on the far side of the south pasture when Pete came running. He was at the creek bank in minutes, in the water in seconds, and he had Millie out and against his chest and up the bank with the focused efficiency of someone for whom the child's safety was the only fact that existed in the world. He sat on the bank holding a soaking, screaming Millie and held her until she stopped screaming and just clung, and he held her through that too, this big, steady man sitting in the mud with a creek-wet child pressed against him. And when Vera arrived running from the house, He looked up at her with an expression that told her everything she needed to know about what this child was to him. Not a practical arrangement, not a complication of a widow's situation. Vera sat down in the mud beside them without caring at all about the mud, and Millie reached one arm for her and kept the other arm around Colt, and the three of them sat on the bank of Sawyer Creek in the May afternoon, wet and shaking and whole. Pete, who was watching from a respectful distance, turned around and went back to his work with the expression of a man who has witnessed something that has settled a question he had not quite been asking. That evening, after the children were in bed, Vera sat across from Colt at the kitchen table and looked at him for a long moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I am not frightened anymore," she said simply. He looked at her. "Whatever it costs," she said, "whatever the risk is, I am not frightened of it anymore because I already know what it is and I have decided it is worth it." She looked at him steadily, this woman who had knocked on the wrong door in a snowstorm with nothing, who had asked only for shelter. "You gave me your name when I asked for one night out of the cold, and I think I've been falling in love with you since the morning I came downstairs and the kitchen was already warm." He was very still across the table. Then he said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "I've been in love with you since you almost laughed in my yard and then decided not to." She did laugh then, low and building and whole-bodied, the first real full laugh since before Martin died, and it filled the kitchen in the house, and something that had been held very carefully in reserve inside her for a long time finally, completely let go. He was smiling across the table, the full open smile of a man who has stopped managing his own expression, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone is happy. This is what I did. Outside, Sawyer Creek ran cold and clear in the May night, and the stars were out over the ranch, and the cattle moved slow in the pasture, and the garden along the south side of the house was coming in green and full of intention. Inside, two people sat at a kitchen table in the warm light and looked at each other with the clear eyes of people who had said the true thing at last and found it answered. Vera Standish had come to Sawyer Creek with nothing. She had knocked on the wrong door, and the wrong door had opened into everything. Some mistakes are the best thing that ever happens to you. Some nights when you are lost in the cold and the dark and you cannot see your way, you count the fence posts wrong. And the door that opens is not the door you were looking for. It is better. If this story found its way to your heart today, I want to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me what moment moved you the most, and tell me where in the world you are watching from right now. Every single comment means everything, and I read every one of them. And if you are new here and you love slow, warm, emotional Western romance stories about women who survive hard seasons and found their way to something real and lasting, please subscribe and ring the bell. There's always a new story here waiting for you. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. And remember, sometimes the wrong door is exactly the right one.